Good morning, viewers. A warm welcome. This is Sage and you are watching Kalkine TV live from the Sydney studio. And this is the Global Markets Roundup show, where we bring you a glimpse of the equity, currency and commodity markets across the globe. Let's begin with a glance at how the global markets fared last night, starting with the US markets. A gauge of the global stocks hit an intraday record on Monday, and US Treasury yields held above 5-month lows reached last week as investors looked for signs on whether the Delta variant of the coronavirus could dent global growth. And concerns about a slowing economic recovery due to climbing cases of the variant around the globe helped send the yield on the benchmark 10-year US Treasury note to a 5-month low of 1.25% last week. The yield had risen to as high as 1.78% in March as expectations for growth picked up with rising vaccination rates. MSCI's gauge of stocks across the globe gained 0.49% after hitting a record, and Wall Street's main indexes closed at their highest levels ever on Monday, lifted by Tesla and bank stocks as investors eyed the start of the second quarter earnings season and a batch of economic data. Well, the Dow Jones Industrial Average rose 130.23 points, or 0.37%. The S&P 500 gained 15.2 points, or 0.35%. And the Nasdaq Composite added 31.32 points, or 0.21%. According to Refinitiv, the S&P 500 companies are expected to gain over 65% in the second quarter. And besides earnings reports, the government's inflation and retail sales data would also be in focus. Fed Chair Jerome Powell is scheduled to testify before the Congress on inflation and the monetary policy in a 2-day session starting Wednesday. The Nasdaq Composite and the S&P 500 hit record highs on Monday's trading, pulled up by the technology and the financial stocks. 10 among 11 major sectors of the S&P 500 remained in positive territory, led by the basic materials and the financial stocks, while the consumer staple shares retreated. Let us now take a look at the newsmakers. In the corporate news, Richard Branson's space tourism company, Virgin Galactic, said that it might sell up to $500 million worth of shares a day after it completed its first manned test flight with its founder on board. The Virgin Galactic stock plunged over 15% after the news. Insurance company Liberty Mutual has signed a joint agreement to acquire the State Auto Financial Corporation for $2.29 billion. or $52 per share in cash, and the shares of STFC rose by over 193% following the announcement. In other news, Tesla CEO Elon Musk testified in a court on Monday to shrug off the allegations of unfair methods used to acquire SolarCity, and Tesla Inc. Tesla stock surged 4.04% after the statement. Shares of Taiwan Semiconductor manufacturing company increased by 1.61%. Nvidia gained 1.77% and ASML Holdings jumped 2.08%. Adobe Inc. fell 0.97%, while Intel advanced 1.01%. Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase, the Bank of America and other big US banks are expected to release their earnings reports this week. The JPM stock rose by 1.60%, BAC gained 1.50% and MasterCard went up by 0.53% ahead of their financial statements. GS advanced 2.60% while Wells Fargo fell 0.32%. In the consumer sector, Walmart's stock decreased by 0.26%, Costco fell 1.23%, and Philip Morris International lost 0.85%. The Procter & Gamble ticked down 0.20%, while Target advanced 1.38%. In the crypto world, Coinbase Global decreased by 2.44% and Bitcoin dropped 2.84% and Ethereum dropped 5.26%. Now we'll take a look at the futures and commodities market. Beginning with the gold futures, they were down 0.22%. Silver increased 0.24%, while copper fell 0.39%. Brent oil decreased 0.42%, and WTI crude was down 0.54%. Moving on now to the bond markets. The 30-year Treasury bond yields was up 0.88%, while the 10-year bond yields increased 0.87%, and the US dollar futures index increased 0.13%. And this was the latest from the US markets. Now it's time for a short break. Please stay tuned as we will take a look at the European and the Asian stock markets.
Hi, this is Andy Liu broadcasting from Kalkine Media Studio in Australia, and I'll be hosting the new Kalkine Wellness Show. The half-hour show will cover topics from how wellness as a concept has become even more significant during COVID, to how becoming vegan may improve your health, and much more. We are excited to showcase our live streaming show to our audience of millions overseas and in Australia. Tune in to Kalkine TV and join me.
Welcome back, Sage here. You're watching Kalkine TV live from the Sydney studios, and this is the Global Markets Roundup show. Let us take a quick look over the European and the Asian stock markets. The European stocks scaled new highs on Monday on broad-based gains, but worries about the pace of the economic recovery made defensive sectors the best bid, while the travel stocks slumped with the Delta variant of the coronavirus becoming dominant. The Pan-European Stock 600 index rose 0.7%, extending gains from Friday after a tumultuous week. And Germany's DAX also briefly touched a new high before closing just below that level. The London markets traded on a mixed note as ongoing COVID-19 worries had brought down the investors' sentiments. Let us look at the newsmakers now. FTSE 100 listed travel stocks such as Rolls-Royce Holdings and International Consolidated Airlines Group shares plunged by around 3.57% and about 3.17% respectively amid worries regarding the Delta variant of the COVID-19 pandemic. They remained the worst performer on the FTSE 100 index. FTSE 250 listed Tate & Lyle shares went up by around 0.42%. British motor insurer Admiral Group shares surged by around 3.78%, and the Daily Mail and General Trust shares went up by around 3.61%. Moving on now to the Asian markets. Japanese shares rebounded on Monday, led by cyclical stocks on the renewed hopes of a swift global economic recovery, while industry bellwether Yoshikawa Electric jumped after raising its annual profit forecast. The Nikkei share average climbed 2.25%, while the broader topics advanced 2.14%. The Japanese government bond futures fell on Monday as the US Treasuries halted an 8-day price rally during the weekend, while the yield on the 10-year bonds was steady ahead of an auction for the 20-year notes. And the benchmark 10-year JGB futures fell 0.01 point, while a trading volume of 9,212 lots, and the 10-year JGB yield was steady at 0.025%. And now let's take a look at the next market in Asia. China's blue chip share index jumped on Monday as risk appetite improved after the central bank said it would cut the reserve requirements to prop up the economy, outweighing any investor concerns about Washington's new sanctions. The blue chip CSI 300 index closed up 1.25%. Despite its strong performance on Monday, the index was, however, down 1.5% for the year and more than 13% below peaks hit in February. China's yuan rebounded from a 2.5-month low against the dollar on Monday as the market awaited the second quarter growth data for more clues on policy direction after the central bank cut the reserve requirements to prop up the economy. And prior to the market opening, the People's Bank of China set the midpoint rate at a more than 2-week low, 30 pips weaker than the previous fix. And finally, South Korean shares posted their biggest daily rise in nearly 2 months on Monday. Tracking Wall Street's record closing highs through gains were capped by spiking COVID-19 cases and caution ahead of the US inflation data due to this week. The benchmark Kospi ended 28.52 points or 0.89% higher, logging the sharpest gain since May 18th and rebounding from a 1.07% decline on Friday. The South Korean shares posted their biggest daily rise in nearly 2 months on Monday, tracking Wall Street's record closing highs, though gains were capped by spiking COVID-19 cases and caution ahead of the US inflation data due this week. The yuan strengthened while the benchmark bond yield fell, and the yuan ended on the onshore settlement platform 0.18% higher than its previous close. And that was how the European and the Asian markets performed last Friday. It's time for a short break, but after the break, we'll take a look at the Australian stock market. So please stay tuned with Kalkine TV. Crypto talk by Kalkine. The crypto market has been red hot given the Bitcoin rally since the past year. And now the most famous cryptocurrency has got competitors, Dogecoin and Ethereum. If the crypto market excites you, tune in with me, Sage, to know the latest developments about the existing digital currencies and the new ones that are joining the race. I'll help you understand the opportunities and the risks the crypto market has in store for you. For all the digital currency related developments, continue watching Crypto Talk by Kalkine. Good morning, viewers. Welcome back. This is Sage. You're watching Kalkine TV, live from Sydney, and this is the Global Markets Roundup show. Let's now take a look at the Australian share market. On Tuesday, the Australian share market is on a positive side today, and on Monday, the ASX 200 rallied 0.83%, supported by the mining stocks, as commodity prices remained robust, while the Australian pharmaceutical industries also had a positive day on an acquisition offer from Wesfarmers. And on Monday, the Australian dollar weakened against the US dollar as a surge in the coronavirus cases in Sydney raised the prospect of an extended lockdown. The New Zealand dollar also traded lower ahead of inflation data due later in the week. The Aussie dollar was trading 0.31% down at 0.7468 US dollars, losing some of the gains made on Friday after it had fallen to a 7-month low earlier that day. And let's now take a look at the newsmakers. Beginning with the ASX All Technology Index was up 0.7% on Monday, recovering some of the losses incurred on Friday when the index dropped over 2.3%, and the Nasdaq 100 surged to a record high on Wall Street, pointing to another positive session for the Australian tech space. And the Australian technology shares such as Afterpay, Xero and Zipco could have a round of recovery today. On Monday, the crude oil prices witnessed some selling pressure as concerns about slowing global economic growth outweighed the prospect of tightening crude oil supply, as talks among the OPEC Plus members to raise outputs in the near future stalled. And the share prices of Australian oil producers such as Santos, Woodside Petroleum, Origin Energy could ease a bit in today's session. The gold prices had fallen on Monday on the back of a stronger US dollar, as the market's participants are cautiously waiting for the US inflation data, which could have an impact on the Fed's timeline for easing its bond buying. And the gold miners such as St Barbara, Newcrest Mining and De Grey Mining might witness a slightly bearish session today. Let's now take a look at the metal space. On Monday, Shanghai steel futures extended the rally, hitting an 8-week high on the backdrop of monetary policy easing measures in China, which faded away the concerns about the output curbs in the world's top steel producer. The iron ore prices for the September futures contract on the Dalian Commodity Exchange also inched higher. On Monday, copper prices slid on concerns about the demand outlook in China, where the economic recovery is appearing to be decelerating, while rising inventories reinforced the negative sentiment. The benchmark copper on the London Metal Exchange was down 1%, and the local miners such as BHP Group, Rio Tinto and Fortescue Metals Group should be on investors' watch list for the day. And that's all for now. Please stay tuned with Kalkine TV for more of the live market updates. We will be back with more news on the markets, economy and diverse themes and sectors. Sage signing off.